quiet Christmas, a house with lights turned off, a voice that once filled stadiums now silent forever. This is not how the story was meant to end. It was the 25th of December, 2016. The world, wrapped in the comfort of holiday rituals, awoke to the news that stunned it into silence. George Michael was gone, not in a dramatic crash, not in the chaos of scandal, but in the stillness of his countryside home in Goring-on-Thames, alone, heart-stopped. As the world sang Last Christmas on repeat, there was something hauntingly poetic about it. A man who gave the world a Christmas anthem passing on the very day it echoed in malls and radios and memories. But for those who knew him or thought they did, the tragedy was deeper than timing. It was the final note in a life scored by glory and grief, by desire and denial, by love and unbearable solitude. He had once said, "I've had a lot of trouble in my life, but none of it ever came from being gay. It came from trying to hide it." Oh, and hide it, he did, for years. Behind designer shades, behind headlines, behind beats so infectious, they masked the heartbreak in his lyrics. George Michael wasn't just a pop star, he was a master of contradiction. A sex symbol who feared being touched, a superstar who craved normalcy, a public figure forced into a private war with himself. The tabloids told their version: scandal, arrests, drugs. But they never told you about Anselmo, the man who broke George's heart. They didn't show you the diary entries, the sleepless nights, the letters unsent, and perhaps they never understood the loneliness of becoming an icon when you can no longer walk the street, but also no longer feel at home in your own skin. This is not a redemption tale, nor is it a cautionary one. This is a story about freedom, the kind that costs you everything. It is a song with verses of fame, choruses of secrecy, and a final bridge sung in whispers. So let us begin not at the start, but at the end. At the moment the lights dimmed, and the world asked, who was George Michael? Really? And more importantly, did he ever find peace, not in applause, but in the silence that followed? Before the spotlight, before the headlines, there was just a boy, shy, round-faced, brown-eyed, sitting on the floor of a suburban home in North London, headphones on, completely entranced by the sound of music, a voice on vinyl, a rhythm he couldn't name, but it stirred something inside him, something he didn't yet understand. Georgios Kyriakos Panayotou, born on the 25th of June, 1963, to a Greek Cypriot father and an English mother. A name too long for stardom, perhaps, but in that name lived two worlds, two cultures, two expectations, two ways of being seen. And already, George was learning how to split himself to survive. His father, Jack, ran a small restaurant, stern, stoic, a man who believed in hard work, in pride, in being a real man. Oh, his mother, Leslie, was the soft place to fall, a former dancer who had given up her own dreams for domestic life. She saw in George a gentleness that the world might mistake for weakness, and she protected it fiercely. At school, George was quiet, slightly overweight, not athletic, not loud. He didn't fit in. And though he wouldn't use the word gay for years to come, he already felt what it meant to be other, to be watched, whispered about. He once confessed, "I knew I was different before I knew what that meant. I just knew I was alone in it." But music was different. Music didn't mock him. It didn't flinch when he danced alone in his room. It welcomed him in, let him become someone else. In front of the mirror, hairbrush in hand, he wasn't Georgios anymore. He was Elvis, or Bowie, or Freddie. For 3 minutes and 20 seconds, he wasn't afraid, but fear lingered. Fear of his body, of his desires, of being found out. He learned to hide, to perform, to become charming, witty, even flamboyant, as long as it kept people from looking too deep. Even as a teenager, he spoke of fame like a lifeline. "If I become famous," he once told a friend, "maybe they'll stop asking what's wrong with me." He dreamed of being loved by millions, not realizing that even that couldn't drown out the sound of shame learned in silence. He wanted to be seen, but not completely. Heard, but not fully known. And so, behind the closed door of his childhood bedroom, a star began to form, built not just from talent, but from need. The need to escape, the need to prove himself, and most of all, the desperate need to be loved, even if he couldn't yet love himself. The beginning wasn't glamorous. It wasn't sold-out arenas or screaming fans. It was two boys, George and his schoolmate Andrew Ridgely, sitting in bedrooms with cheap instruments and big dreams. Together, they called themselves Wham! An exclamation point not just in name, but in energy. A bubblegum pop explosion bursting out of Thatcher-era Britain. It was the 1982nd since Neon, Youth Rebellion wrapped in pastel suits, and George Michael, now trimmed, stylish, charismatic, fit the image perfectly, at least on the outside. Their first hit, Wham Rap, was cheeky, defiant, but it was Wake Me Up Before You Go, that changed everything. Suddenly, Wham wasn't just a novelty act. They were global. Teen idols, magazine covers, MTV darlings. George danced, smiled, flirted with the camera. He played the role so well that few noticed how carefully he kept the real version of himself behind the curtain. Behind the scenes, he was terrified that someone would find out he was gay, terrified it would all end. This was the era when queer artists either stayed silent or created elaborate facades. Elton John had just married. Freddie Mercury gave elusive answers. There was no space, no safety for a gay man at the top of the charts. And so George constructed a version of himself that could be adored. The heartthrob, the flirt, the ladies' man. He dated women publicly, posed with models, gave charming interviews. He was in control of his image, of his sound, of his secrets. But even at the height of Wham's fame, he knew it couldn't last. Not the band, not the illusion. He began writing darker, deeper music, more soulful, more grown-up. Songs like Careless Whisper, with that haunting saxophone, hinted at something more intimate, more painful. He was no longer content with being a pop product. He wanted to be an artist, a truth teller. But how could he tell the truth when it meant risking everything? In 1986, Wham! Disbanded. The world thought it was mutual, but privately, George was pushing towards something greater and farther away from Andrew, who had been both his best friend and a safe place to hide. The next year, he released Faith, the leather jacket, the stubble, the iconic guitar riff. It was his reinvention, his declaration. George Michael was no longer a boy in a pop duo. He was a solo force, a sex symbol, a chart-topping star. And yet, the mask remained. He once said, "I created a persona, an image that was meant to protect me, but it became a prison I couldn't escape." Even as he conquered the world, he was still pretending, still afraid. Still, that boy in the bedroom. Only now, the door was made of gold records and platinum hits. The guitar strummed once, twice, then that unmistakable beat kicked in. Well, I guess it would be nice. Faith wasn't just a song. It was a cultural moment. Leather jacket, Ray-Bans, denim tight enough to be scandalous. George Michael had rebranded himself not only as a pop god, but as something even more dangerous. A man who could sell sex and soul in the same breath. The album Faith went on to sell over 25 million copies. It topped charts around the world. It won the Grammy for Album of the Year. George was now one of the biggest artists on the planet, rivaling Madonna, Prince, and Michael Jackson. But unlike them, he was hiding in plain sight. His lyrics hinted at longing, at heartbreak, at desire unspoken. Father figure, one more try, kissing a fool. These weren't just pop songs. They were confessions coded in metaphor, wrapped in flawless production. To the casual listener, they were universal. To George, they were desperate whispers through the microphone, saying everything he couldn't in interviews. In private, he was spiraling. Fame brought luxury, but also isolation. He couldn't walk down the street without being mobbed. He couldn't trust anyone without wondering if they were selling his secrets. He couldn't love anyone, at least not openly. And yet, he was in love with Anselmo Falepa, a Brazilian fashion designer he had met in 1991. It was fast. It was passionate. It was dangerous. Because George Michael, the man on every magazine cover, was still not out. Not to his fans. Not to the industry. Barely even to himself. He once said, "Falling in love with Anselmo was like being handed a mirror. And for the first time, I didn't look away." But their love existed only behind closed doors. In fleeting glances, in cities where no one knew them. It was a love full of laughter, of late-night talks, of holding hands in secret, and it was fleeting. Anselmo tested positive for HIV in the early 92nd of time when the diagnosis still felt like a death sentence. George was devastated, terrified. He had just found someone who saw him, truly saw him, and now he was watching that person slip away. He channeled his grief into music. Jesus to a Child, released years later, was a eulogy in melody, a hymn of love, loss, and guilt, so beautiful, so raw, that many still don't realize it was written for a man. But back then, He couldn't say it, couldn't dedicate the song out loud, couldn't tell the world why he wept while performing it. He told Oprah once, "I was never able to tell anyone I was in love." That in itself is a form of torture. And so the world saw the smile, the stubble, the swagger, but they didn't see the man behind the mirror, didn't hear the cries behind the chorus, didn't know that George Michael, the megastar, was also George Michael, the grieving lover. It's strange, isn't it, that someone so famous could feel so invisible? There are loves that exist in photo albums, in old texts, in rings exchanged, and then there are the kinds of love that exist only in memory, whispered names, unspoken feelings, moments that lived once and never again. For George Michael, most of his deepest loves belong to the second kind. After Anselmo Falepa's death in 1993, something in George shattered. He never fully recovered from it. The man who had finally made him feel seen was gone, and the world never even knew they had loved each other. He was forced to mourn in silence. No public tribute, no holding a lover's hand at the funeral, no space in newspapers for his heartbreak. In one interview, he said, "I sat at the top of the charts. I was adored, but I'd go home and cry because I couldn't call the man I loved my partner. He was just a friend to the world, and that killed me." His next relationships were careful, guarded, fragmented. He feared falling in love again, not just because of heartbreak, but because love meant exposure. To love openly was to risk everything. There was Kenny Goss, his long-term partner of over a decade. Handsome, Texan, quietly supportive. They were together during some of George's most public battles, the arrests, the tabloid scandals, the breakdowns, but they were rarely seen hand in hand. Their love lived in shadows, behind hedges, in the margins of stories. George once said, "Kenny saved my life, but he also didn't fully know how much of me was still broken." Even as the world evolved, as other celebrities began coming out, as gay marriage became legal in places like the UK, George remained complicated. He had come out to the public by then, yes, but coming out didn't mean he could love without fear. Not when the press still hunted him, not when every partner risked becoming a headline. His lyrics often told the truths he couldn't. Songs like "Outside" were cheeky responses to scandal, but deeper tracks like "My Mother Had a Brother" and "You Have Been Loved" were achingly honest windows into a man haunted by absence, by shame, by longing. There were rumors, lovers unnamed, encounters in parks and public places, not out of recklessness, but out of desperation for connection in a world that wouldn't allow it in daylight. He once said, not bitterly, but with quiet sadness, "I never had the luxury of a normal relationship. My love life has always been a war between privacy and the need to feel alive." To love, for George Michael, was to risk exposure. To mourn was to do it alone. To desire was to carry guilt inherited from a time when love between two men was a crime, a scandal, a shame. And so his greatest romances, the ones that made him sing, that made him break, were often the ones we never got to see. The names we'll never know, the letters never sent, the photos never taken. It is perhaps his greatest tragedy, not the scandals, not the fame, not even the addictions, but that the world gave him stages, but never the freedom to hold the hand of the one he loved on them. It was April 1998, a warm afternoon in Los Angeles. George Michael walked into Will Rogers Park, a well-known cruising spot, a place where men had met in secret for decades. He wasn't looking for trouble. He wasn't even looking for sex, necessarily. He was looking for something far more complicated: relief from the loneliness, from the performance, from the mask that had become too heavy to wear. Minutes later, he was arrested for lewd conduct by an undercover police officer. The details were everywhere. The media ran with it like wolves smelling blood. The golden boy of British pop caught in a public bathroom. In an instant, years of carefully managed image collapsed. The tabloids feasted. Late-night hosts joked. Headlines screamed, "George Michael exposed." But it wasn't just his body that was exposed. It was his identity, his shame, his secrets. For the first time, the world saw George Michael not as the heartthrob, not as the polished performer, but as a gay man caught in a moment of human vulnerability. He could have denied it. He could have gone silent. He could have done what many before him had done, hide again. But he didn't. Instead, he appeared on television, disheveled, honest, defiant, and said plainly, "I have no problem with being gay. I have a problem with being forced to come out under circumstances that weren't mine to choose." It was a declaration, not just of identity, but of agency. He followed it up with a music video for "Outside," a disco satire featuring police officers in tight uniforms dancing in public restrooms. It was bold, It was camp. It was George Michael saying, "You want to shame me? I'll make it a hit single." But behind the defiance was still a man bruised. Coming out under coercion isn't the same as coming out with pride. The media didn't just report it, they ridiculed it. They made his sexuality a punchline, his desires a pathology, and it reopened every old wound. The shame from childhood, the hiding in WAM, the fear during Anselmo's illness. Yet something shifted. He no longer had to lie, no longer had to pretend. For the first time, George Michael could live not as a persona, not as a product, but as a person. Still, the backlash was brutal. Some fans turned away. Some sponsors vanished. He was called a disgrace, a deviant, a has-been. But from within that wreckage, a quieter freedom began to bloom. He could now write songs without disguise. He could speak about love without metaphors. He could finally grieve Anselmo in the open, acknowledging the love he had lost, the years he had mourned in silence. The outing wasn't his choice, but what he did with it, the humor, the courage, the raw truth was. In later interviews, he would reflect, "I lost control that day in LA, but maybe I had already lost it long before. And maybe that's what I needed, not more control, but to finally let go." That arrest, that moment of exposure, became not just a scandal, but a portal, a doorway into a version of himself that was flawed, vulnerable, angry, free. And from that doorway, he stepped out, not as an idol, not as an icon, but as a man who had nothing left to hide. He was out, not just to the world, but to himself. The mask had cracked. The truth was out there. But truth, as liberating as it might be, doesn't always come with peace. In the years that followed his public outing, George Michael began to unravel, slowly at first. Then, all at once, the headlines no longer screamed about chart-topping singles. They reported car crashes, possession charges, public intoxication, moments of humiliation. A man once worshipped by millions, now seen slumped in the driver's seat, asleep at the wheel. He was arrested multiple times. Once for crashing into a storefront, another time for being found unconscious at a traffic light. Each time, the media devoured it. Each time, George seemed to slip further from the man he once was. Behind the arrests were deeper, quieter battles. A dependency on marijuana, prescription pills, sleeping aids, a mind that couldn't rest, a heart still aching from old losses. He admitted later, "I was in emotional pain. I didn't care if I woke up the next morning." He spoke too of voices in his head, of grief that never ended, of guilt for Anselmo, for Kenny, for letting his fans down. There were times he withdrew completely, vanished from public life. No albums, no tours, no interviews, just the walls of his home, the silence of rooms that once echoed with music, now thick with memory. He once said, "When you're famous, people think you have company all the time. But fame is one of the loneliest places on earth." And it showed. Friends noticed. His weight fluctuated. His sparkle dimmed. He looked like a man carrying a ghost on his back, one too heavy to put down, but too private to explain. Some tried to help. Kenny Goss remained in his life, even after their romantic relationship ended. Elton John reached out, concerned, but George resented intervention. He had always been fiercely independent, fiercely proud. Even as he was falling, he didn't want to be saved, at least not publicly. And yet, amidst the chaos, he never stopped creating. He recorded in bursts, wrote songs in the quiet, but the releases were few and far between, reflections of a man who once thrived on rhythm, now swallowed by restlessness. He spoke of depression not as an event, but a landscape, something he had learned to walk through, again and again. And for George, there was no map, no guiding star, only music, and even that, at times, abandoned him. These were the lost years, the ones fans don't talk about much, the ones with fewer photos, fewer tours, fewer smiles. But they matter because they show that even icons bleed, even legends shatter, and sometimes the brightest stars don't fade, they collapse inward, carrying the weight of galaxies no one ever saw. He had been bruised, he had been mocked, he had been left behind by an industry that once called him golden. But George Michael never stopped being an artist. Even in the quietest years, when headlines drowned in scandal and gossip, when he vanished from stages and red carpets, his voice remained. And slowly, through that voice, he began to return, not to reclaim stardom, not to resurrect a brand, but to redefine himself on his own terms. In 2004, he released Patience, an album that bore the rawness of survival. It wasn't a chart smash, but it didn't need to be. It was filled with melancholy, reflection, and an unmistakable maturity. A man singing not to impress, but to speak finally as himself. Then came the tour. In 2006, George Michael embarked on 25 Live, his first in over a decade. The arenas were packed, not just with diehard fans, but with people who had grown up, grown older, grown into themselves just as he had. When he walked on stage, he didn't come back as the leather-clad sex icon of faith. He came back as George, older, softer, realer. He told stories between songs, laughed at himself, cried during tributes to Anselmo and his mother. He wasn't hiding anymore, and the crowd didn't need him to. He had become something rarer than a pop star. He had become a human being who survived his own myth, and through it all, he gave back. Quietly, generously, he donated millions to HIV, AIDS charities, children's hospitals, LGBTQ+ youth shelters. He once walked into a cafe, saw a woman crying about money, and left a check for £25,000. He refused to publicize it. When asked, he said, "You don't help people to be seen helping. You help because someone needs it." He also began speaking openly about gay rights, mental health, and the importance of queer visibility. In an interview, he said, "If one kid hears me and feels less alone, then every mistake, every headline, every stupid thing I did was worth it." This wasn't just a comeback, it was a transformation. He no longer needed to be worshipped. He only wanted to be understood. His later songs, December Song, White Light, Through, weren't radio anthems. They were letters, folded gently and left behind. For fans, for lost lovers, for himself. In 2012, after a life-threatening bout of pneumonia, George said, "I saw the light. I don't know how else to say it. And it reminded me that I still had something to give." He sang at the closing ceremony of the London Olympics, not as a symbol of British pop glory, but as a survivor. Am I still standing? Still singing? Still healing? Not everyone noticed. Some still saw him as a tabloid figure. Others couldn't let go of the past. But those who listened, truly listened, heard something sacred. A man who had lost lovers, lost his privacy, lost his illusions, but found his voice again. Not to conquer, but to tell the truth. What is a legacy? Is it platinum records? Sold-out tours? Awards stacked in glass cases? Or is it something quieter? Something that pulses inside people who never met you, but feel you saved them anyway. George Michael's true legacy is this. He made people feel less alone. Not just with his music though, that too carried its own salvation, but with his honesty, his imperfections, his refusal to fit into the clean, polished mold that fame demanded. He stood flawed, funny, wounded, and said, "This is me. Take it or leave it." And for many, especially within the LGBTQ+ community, that was radical. He wasn't the first gay pop star. He wasn't the loudest activist, but he was one of the few who walked through fire in public and lived to tell the story in his own voice. Young men who feared their own reflection saw courage in his softness. Queer kids in small towns whispered his lyrics like prayer. Older generations, those who lived through AIDS, through hiding, through shame, saw in him a reflection of their survival. And beyond identity, there was artistry. George Michael was one of the greatest vocalists of his generation. Soulful, controlled, emotional, effortless. Whether it was the aching restraint of One More Try, the anthemic freedom of Freedom 2090, or the sacred stillness of Praying for Time, his voice didn't just sing, it confessed, it bled, it reached for something divine. Critics called him underrated, but fans knew the truth. George Michael wasn't underrated. He was misunderstood. Too pop for soul, too soul for pop, too gay, too private, too political, too emotional. He refused to be boxed in and paid the price for it. But time has a way of softening edges, of reframing stories, of turning scandal into myth and myth into truth. In the years since his death, the narrative around George has changed. New documentaries, tributes, artists citing him as influence from Sam Smith to Troye Sivan, from Adele to Harry Styles. The LGBTQ+ community remembers him not just for coming out, but for coming through, for falling and getting up, for being angry and still loving, for being messy and still magical. He gave money to causes when no one was watching. He wrote lyrics that only made sense to those who had hidden the same way he had. He sang about heartbreak, not like a pop star, but like a man who had lost something he would never get back. His music endures. But more than that, his courage endures. George Michael gave the world more than pop hits. He gave it permission. Permission to feel, to question, to desire, to break and rebuild, To live honestly, even if the honesty comes too late. Christmas morning, 2016. Snow in some corners of England. Silence in others. Inside a modest riverside home in Goring-on-Thames, George Michael was found lifeless, his heart finally giving way. He was only 53. No scandal, no overdose, no final note left behind. Just a man, once larger than life, now still. A voice once heard by millions quiet. The world mourned. Not with hysteria, but with a hush. Because George Michael wasn't just an icon. He was something more fragile, more human, a reminder of what it costs to live in the in-between, between fame and freedom, between pride and shame, between who we show the world and who we cry as when no one's looking. The tributes poured in. Fans left candles and handwritten notes outside his home. Radio stations played Jesus to a Child and Careless Whisper on loop. Former lovers, friends, collaborators, they all told stories of a man who was private, generous, hilarious, wounded, kind. Elton John said, "I've lost a beloved friend, the kindest, most generous soul." But even as the world remembered, there was something unresolved. George never got the full arc. No late life redemption album, no tell-all memoir, no final tour. His life didn't end with applause. It ended in silence. And perhaps that silence says more than any song could. Because George Michael's life was never really about perfection. It was about contradictions. A man who could bring arenas to their feet, yet felt unworthy of love. A man who gave millions away to charity, but couldn't save himself from loneliness. A man who wrote music for the world, yet kept his own truth locked behind lyrics. And yet, in that imperfection, he became real. To the queer teen afraid to speak, to the man mourning a partner in secret, to the woman who felt unseen in her grief, to anyone who has ever whispered to the dark, "Will anyone ever understand me?" George did. His music lives on, not just on playlists, but in memories, in tears shed at 2 a.m., in kisses stolen under streetlights, in the courage to say, for the first time, "This is who I am." And maybe that's what freedom really is. Not the absence of pain, but the choice to tell your story anyway, even when it costs you, even when they don't believe you, even when it breaks you. To sing, to love, to live out loud. That was George Michael's final love song. And though he's gone, its echo still plays in every broken heart that dares to hope again. You'll never find peace of mind until you listen to your heart. George Michael,